Further ado, I'm Dr. Erica Trappel, and I'd like to welcome you to our November research seminar for the PRCHN's Research Seminar Series. We're so glad that you could join us today. Our presentation today will be titled Exploring the Link Between Neighborhood Racial Segregation and Supermarket and Grocery Store Locations in Cleveland, a Bayesian Spatial Analysis. And this will be presented today by our good friend and colleague, Dr. Ortis Yankee. Before we get started, we always just like to remind you that if you have not connected with us before, we encourage you to connect with us now. You can always find our work at our website at www.prchn.org, and you can follow us on the socials. I just noticed we haven't updated our little Twitter to an X, but we are still there, at least for the time being. We also want to let you know about our next seminar, which will be held on Wednesday, December 13th. So we invite you to register. We're going to put the link in our chat box and ask you to register now so that you get that on your calendar. Our speaker in December will be Dr. Marcia Tan, who will be presenting her talk on adapting a tobacco cessation training curriculum to promote intervention delivery among community health workers. Dr. Tan is an assistant professor of epidemiology and behavioral sciences in the Department of Public Health at the University of Chicago, and we are all very excited to host her next month. So again, we're going to put that registration in the chat, and we encourage you to register now so that you can join us again next month. As we have done now since the start of the COVID pandemic, we have continued to keep our seminars virtual, but we don't want to limit the interaction. So we want to encourage you to introduce yourself with your name and organization in the chat so that others know who is here joining us on the call today. We want to make sure to keep this interactive. And so after the presentation, we will open the seminar for questions, invite you to either use the chat box for those questions or take yourself off of mute, raise your hand, and we'll be happy to call on you to engage in conversation with our presenter. And so without further ado, I am very excited and honored to introduce Dr. Ortis Yankee. Dr. Yankee is a research fellow and geospatial data scientist with the World POP Research Group in the School of Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Southampton, yes, in England, joining us from several time zones away. His research interests are in spatial demography and spatial epidemiology, and his current research focuses on developing bespoke spatial and Bayesian statistical methods to map the distribution of populations and demographic characteristics at high resolution across low and middle income countries through integration of data from diverse sources such as geospatial data, remotely sensed imagery, cell phone usage data, and survey data. So lots of different data sources really coming together. It's very exciting. He also focuses on examining the spatial and spatio-temporal distribution of health outcomes among low-income populations. And his previous research focused on examining disparities in food environments here in Cleveland. Dr. Yankee holds a PhD from Kent State University here in Ohio. And as I said, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Yankee and to hear more about his work. So at this point, I will go ahead and stop sharing and invite Dr. Yankee to share his screen. Thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Sure. Let me position certain things very well. All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Trappel, and for having me present to the PRC. And I think it's wonderful reconnecting back to the PRC. I can see Professor Elaine here, who happened to be my PhD external advisor during my time at Kent State University. So it's wonderful. You know, in 2019, I got to intern with the PRC, and I got to know some of the wonderful work that the PRC was doing in Cleveland. And these research works, you know, form the basis for my PhD dissertation. So I guess it's nice reconnecting back. So I know Dr. Trappel have introduced me, but for other people who may not know me. So my name is Otis, and I hold a PhD from Kent State University. I graduated in 2022. But before then, after I defended my PhD dissertation, I got the opportunity to come and work at the University of Southampton with the World POP Research Group. And what we do is that the World POP, we specialize in population mapping. And so we use things like survey data, things like geospatial data from remote sensed imagery to kind of predict population numbers for low and middle income countries, where regular census is an issue, and also where population projections become quickly outdated. So that is what I've been doing within this past 2 years. But before that, I was involved in health geography, analyzing health outcomes across different geographic spaces. So I've done some work when it comes to obesity. I've done some work on mental health, some on malnutrition across African countries and intimate partner violence. So I guess it's afternoon over there, it's evening here. So maybe I'll be interchanging afternoon and evening. So this afternoon, I'll be looking at exploring the link between neighborhood racial segregation and supermarkets or grocery stores location in Cleveland from a Bayesian standpoint, Bayesian spatial analysis standpoint. And I did this work with Professor Lane and also Rachel, who happened to be at the PRC. I think she's now doing her medicine, right? Yes, so I did this work with them in addition to my PhD advisor at Kent State University. So as a way of an outline, I'll start talking about the motivation for the study, and I'll briefly talk about introduction to the literature regarding healthy food access. And then we'll talk about my method, and I'll look at the results and the implications of the results, as well as conclude the study. So regarding the reason why I wanted to pursue this work, we all know that access to stores, that supply a large variety of healthy food are essential for the well-being of communities, because we know that certain kind of sicknesses or diseases, such as obesity, such as stroke, such as diabetes and hypertension, are all associated with, people not eating healthy food, right? People consuming a large amount of junk food. And we also know that racial segregation, remains a critical issue that affects neighborhoods within Cleveland. So redlining of cities, across US, also historical legacies of redlining also has an effect when we look at the physical environment of Cleveland. And when we are ranking most segregated cities across the US, depending on the method that you use, Cleveland ranks between 5 and 10, depending on the method I use to measure racial segregation. So Cleveland basically is within the top 10 most segregated cities across the US. And in 2019, when I had the opportunity to intern with the PRC, going through the neighborhood and collecting food retail data set, I saw the disparities when it comes to access to grocery stores. So it's as a result of this background that I thought it's important, to explore whether there is some kind of relationship between racial segregation and also the availability of supermarkets and grocery stores in Cleveland. So this reason motivated this particular study. Right. So when we are talking about the food environment, the food environment has to do with places like supermarkets and grocery stores, as well as corner stores where people get their food, and also restaurants where people go and buy food to eat. And the food environment, when you look at the literature on the food environment, you can group the food environments in terms of the stores into healthy retail food outlets and then unhealthy ones, right? So large stores like supermarkets, large and small groceries that supply a large variety of healthy food products can be grouped as healthy food retail outlet, whilst things like maybe restaurant or fast food restaurants, as well as corner stores, which supply lesser amount of these healthy food products, can be classified as unhealthy retail outlet. And when you look at the food environment literature, disparities tends to exist when it comes to access to supermarket and grocery stores that supply a large amount of healthy food options. And this disparity tends to affect low-income communities as well as minority communities. So first, we've established that there is disparity when it comes to access to supermarket and grocery stores, and it tends to affect low-income and ethnic minority communities. And several reasons, have been proposed to establish the reason why this exists within inner cities. But we can classify some of these factors into two main groups. One of them, the reason why we have this disparity, one of them relate to issue of supply and demand, which we can link it to neoclassical economic theory. And under neoclassical economic theory, it has to do with the interplay of market forces, basically demand and supply, that kind of dictate the kind of products that is available in the market. And so when we are looking at disparities in terms of healthy food access, certain researchers like Alcott, Bonanno, and Bettler, they've hypothesized that socioeconomic factors, affect demand and supply of supermarket and grocery stores. And so they basically argue that the reason why we have limited access to supermarket and grocery stores in inner cities has to do with the fact that there is limited demand for healthy food within inner cities. And sometimes when you even establish some of these stores, people living within inner cities or Black communities don't patronize these stores. So eventually these stores goes out of business. And these stores are capitalists who are interested in making profits rather than, feeding poor people. And so they would rather establish their store at locations where they have easy markets, where people patronize the stores and they can get more profits. So when we look at the literature regarding socioeconomic factors, being a constraint to the supply of these stores, we see the example of limited demand for healthy food in low-income communities. And also, these researchers also argue that things like declining population within inner cities, things like higher poverty rate, and things like higher crime rate, for example, pose a supply as well as a demand constraint towards the establishment of supermarket and grocery stores in inner cities. And hence, we see these disparities when it comes to access to healthy food within inner cities. The second reason that has been hypothesized to be the reason why we have disparities in terms of supermarkets and grocery store has to do with racial segregation. So Quaid, for example, Quaid 2008, argues that racial segregation is a fundamental cause of inequality when it comes to healthy food access, right? And so when we look at racial segregation, racial segregation has long been established as the foundation for Black and white health disparities. So when you look at any health outcome across the US, in most cases, it disproportionately affects Black people compared to white people. And racial segregation, racial segregation, being the legacy of the redlining of cities. So the historical redlining of cities, where certain neighborhood within cities were color-coded, said that they didn't receive much investment, has caused some of these segregation that we see across cities. We still see the effect of some of these housing policies that were instituted in the middle part of the 20th century. We also see that, structural factors and economic systems have made inner cities unattractive for large-scale investment in supermarket and grocery stores. And some authors have also argued that, from the 1970 onwards, there was a capital flight. There was a flight of supermarkets from inner cities towards the suburbs as more white population and affluent population began to move towards the suburb. These stores also moved along with them. So what we see right now is that we have retail gap when it comes to supermarket and grocery stores distribution across inner cities. So 2 reasons have been proposed to be associated with the disparities that we see when it comes to supermarket and grocery store. One being socioeconomic factors, being a demand and supply constraint, and the other one being racial segregation. So what we sought to do in this study is, between these 2 factors, which one offers a much better explanation of supermarket and grocery stores, the spatial distribution of supermarket and grocery stores within the city of Cleveland. So that is what we sought to do in this particular research work. Another thing that I also want to emphasize is on how we measure racial segregation when we are looking at disparities when it comes to access. We have different dimensions that can be used to measure racial segregation. So in a seminal paper, in the pioneering paper by Massey and Dunton, 1988, in which they came up with the first method to measure racial segregation, they came up with 5 main dimensions of segregation. One being evenness measure, which has to do with how a particular racial composition deviates from the city's average, right? The other one being exposure, how 2 groups are exposed to each other. We have measures of concentration, we have clustering and centralization. So the method that you use in calculating or in creating segregation has an effect on the kind of spatial pattern that you will see on the landscape, right? So each of these 5 dimensions we have different methods within them that we use to calculate racial segregation. But oftentimes when you look at the food environment literature and also examining disparities, some of these dimensions are not considered in terms of looking at disparity in terms of access. They sometimes use, let's say, simplistic measure like percentage of Black people or percentage of Latino or percentage of Asian in looking at some of these disparities in terms of healthy food access. The other thing that we also sought to do was to also take a spatial perspective in analyzing the food environment. So obviously, the location of stores, is geographical in nature. And so in examining the association of stores or disparities when it comes to healthy food access, as well as other socioeconomic or racial factors, it is important to consider what is called spatial effects in the modeling. When some of these things are not accounted for in the modeling, it can introduce bias in the results that you get. So all these things, with regards to all these issues, we decided to have a look at, to examine the association between racial segregation and socioeconomic factors on the spatial distribution of grocery stores and supermarkets within the city of Cleveland, and also to then examine between racial segregation and socioeconomic factors, which of these 2 factors, complementary factors, offer a better explanation of the supermarket and grocery stores distribution in the city of Cleveland. And in doing so, we sought to adopt formal segregation measures to measure the level of segregation across Cleveland. And also we decided to use a Bayesian spatial approach. Bayesian statistics is a bit different from frequency statistics. So the statistics that are taught in, let's say, graduate schools are called frequency statistics. With Bayesian statistics, we introduce the idea of what is called a prior into the modeling, which reflects our belief regarding the distribution of a particular parameter of interest, right, in the modeling to make inference. So we adopted a Bayesian spatial approach, where the spatial approach accounted for spatial random effect in the modeling. As a method, the data source, we use the 2019 NIP retail outlet data, right? And the NIP data is very rich. It's longitudinal. I got used to it when I was doing the internship. And so in the NIP data set, which obviously everyone here knows about it, it's longitudinal. So we have different classification of stores within the NIP data set. We have supermarkets, large grocery, small grocery, corner stores, convenience stores, restaurants, and fast food. So we decided to use the 2019 retail store count for Cleveland. And the outcome of interest that you were interested in is the count of supermarkets, large and small groceries, right? So when you look at the food environment literature, these stores are often considered as healthy food retail outlet. So in line with previous research, we also grouped these stores and then counted them based on their count within a census tract. So the unit of analysis was census tract boundaries within the city of Cleveland. And then we geocode the stores and count the number of stores within a given census tract. In terms of our explanatory variables, we had socioeconomic variables as well as demographic variables from the US Census Bureau. Based on the American Community Survey data, we use the 5-year estimate. So we settled on these socioeconomic variables, which is the percentage of poverty rate, percentage of SNAP recipient, percentage of household car ownership, percentage of vacant housing, and percentage of college-educated people. Now, there were a lot of variables that we could have considered, but we know that socioeconomic variables are oftentimes highly correlated with each other. So we checked for multicollinearity among these variables and decided to drop certain variables that were highly correlated with each other. And also, all these variables here, have some form of relationship when it comes to demand of healthy food products. For example, poverty, poverty rate, can have an effect on whether someone will be able to buy certain products. With the demographic variables that we had from the US Census Bureau, we decided to calculate 3 main segregation indices. One of them is the multiracial entropy index. And now the multiracial entropy index considers different racial groupings within a given census tract in the calculation. So with the multiracial entropy index, we considered white population, Black population, Asian population, and Hispanic population. And then we developed the multiracial entropy index. And the index ranges from 0 to 1. And so places with a value of 0 are places where segregation is low. And as you move towards 1, we have a particular group dominating. And so it's the index gives that particular location as having a higher level of segregation. The other segregation measure that we also considered has to do with Black clustering, right? So Black clustering looked at the concentration of Black people within certain areas in Cleveland. And with this one, we use a spatial statistical method called the G-statistics, which defines hotspots for Black people and also cold spots for Black people. And then we grouped this hotspot into higher clustering based on Z-scores. So areas that had positive Z-score were classified as having higher Black clustering. Areas that had negative Z-scores were classified as having low Black clustering. We did the same thing also for white population and found higher clustering of white people and low clustering of white people. And we also decided to keep percentage of Hispanic population and also percentage of Asian population. So we have these explanatory variables, to examine the association with the count of supermarkets, the count of supermarket, large and also small groceries within the city of Cleveland. And we use census tracts as our unit of analysis. So here we see the spatial distribution of the variables. This is the count of stores across Cleveland, count of grocery stores and supermarkets across Cleveland. And these are some of the explanatory variables. We adopted a Bayesian framework for the analysis. And this formula here defines the general formula for the analysis. Now, because we had excessive number of zeros in some census tract, we decided to use a zero inflated Poisson model to account for over dispersion within our modeling. So our model was giving us an intercept shown here as beta naught plus the covariate plus UJ. UJ signifies a spatial random effect to account for spatial autocorrelation due to neighborhood structure within the data sets. The EJ here signifies expected rate, which was used as an offset to capture population differences across the different census tracts in Cleveland. And in fitting the model, we fitted 4 main models. The first model is a null model or an intercept-only model. And with that model, it's only spatial random effects that explains the distribution of the stores. So we have no covariates in the first model. In the second model, we looked at neighborhood segregation as the only factors explaining the distribution of the stores. In the third model, we look at socioeconomic factors as the only factors explaining the distribution of the stores. And then in the last model, which is the fourth one, we combined all the variables to see how they explain the spatial distribution of the stores in Cleveland. And in Bayesian analysis, we assign priors to each parameter of interest within the modeling. And here I use non-informative prior, which means the priors I use have a very large standard deviation. And so they have little influence regarding the model. So it said that the results that we get closely approximate a frequentist statistical model. Okay. So here is the descriptive statistics for our steady variables. We see that, in Cleveland, percentage of people, the mean percentage of people below poverty was the highest. We have about 36.37% mean regarding the population of people below poverty, and the standard deviation is also very high. Also, the mean for the percentage of household SNAP recipient was also quite high, around 36.76%. And with this, with our steady variable, we also see that multicollinearity was, reduced to the barest minimum. We use a threshold of 6 to eliminate variables. So when you look at the variance inflation factor, all the variables here are below that particular threshold, which means that multicollinearity was minimized regarding our modeling. Okay, so now let's look at the models. So the first model here represents the adjusted effect. So one thing about Bayesian statistics is that anytime you fit a model, unlike frequentist model that gives a single value, Bayesian statistics give what is known as a posterior distribution, right? So the outcome of interest or the parameter of interest comes with a lot of values, and that is a distribution. So we summarize that particular distribution using either the mean or the median value. So here, these values here are log odds. They are odd ratios. They are odd ratios. So they've been exponentiated from the log scale. But because it is a distribution, we find the mean of the distribution, right? So Bayesian statistics gives posterior estimates. Then you use the mean to summarize those estimates. So we have the mean and also the 95% credible interval, which is similar to 95% confidence interval in frequentist statistics. So here, the model one is the baseline model, which has no covariate. So I'll focus my attention on the model two, which looks at the effect of racial segregation on the spatial distribution of the stores. And the variables that are highlighted in yellow are variables in which has a positive association with the spatial distribution or count of the stores. So we see that in high white clustered census tract, the percentage of the store count, increases by 92% compared to areas where we have low white clustering. And also percentage of Asian, we see a 2% increase in the count of store. And also for Hispanic population, we see a 2% increase in the count of store for Hispanic population. Now, when you take the entropy index, the multiracial entropy index, which is one of the measures of segregation that we use here, we see a decrease in the count of stores as the level of segregation increased. And when you also take areas where we have higher Black clustered population, the count of stores kind of decreases by about 13%, right? So whilst areas where we have a higher proportion of white people have more stores, in areas where we have a higher proportion of Black people, the number of stores tend to decrease per this particular resource. Here we also see that we also present the model 3 looks at the socioeconomic factors, and we see that percentage of people below poverty has a positive association, as well as percentage of household with no vehicle also has a positive association with the count of supermarket and grocery stores. And this is the fourth model, which combines all the variables in looking at the count of stores. From the fourth model, variables in terms of the magnitude or the direction of association, variables that were positive were still positive when we combine all of them together, and variables that were negative, that had negative association with stores, also were still negative when we combine all of them together. So the question is, among all these four models, which one offers a much better explanatory power when it comes to the count of stores, the count of grocery stores and supermarket within Cleveland? So with that, we use what is known as the deviance information criterion, which is similar to the Akaike information criterion, saying that a model with a lower DIC value signifies a better model when models are being compared. So with the four models, model 2, which looks at racial segregation, had a DIC value of 476.29. And this value was the smallest when we compare all the four models. And so this goes to mean that this shows that, racial segregation measures offers a much better explanation of the food environment of supermarket and grocery stores distribution within the city of Cleveland. So what are some of the implication of the results that we've had so far? First, we've been able to establish, the primacy of racial segregation factors in explaining supermarket and grocery store distribution. When we compare the model performance, we see that racial segregation outperforms socioeconomic factors in explaining the count of stores within the city of Cleveland. And so I think that's, effort in addressing some of these retail gaps within Black communities should be a policy focus, so that we can increase healthy food within Black communities. Now, having said that, this research is also by no means invalidating the effect of socioeconomic factors. I think socioeconomic factors also play a role when it comes to the food environment situation in Cleveland. And also socioeconomic factors and racial factors are intertwined. And so in terms of addressing some of these gaps when it comes to supermarket and grocery store, it's important to also address certain socioeconomic inequalities when it comes to healthy food access. And also one of the things that we can be done in future. So this research work is cross-sectional. And so it's not to establish, it's only to establish an association, not a causation. So maybe in future, looking at longitudinal data analysis would be able for us to tease some kind of causal inference when we are looking at the distribution of supermarket and grocery stores. So in conclusion, this study kind of support the hypothesis that racial segregation is a fundamental cause of food desert, and we've seen that in the city of Cleveland. And I will leave you with a quote by Slocum and Sadanha, in which they stated that racism is endemic to global food systems in the aftermath of colonialism, with predictable results for minority communities. So this brings me to the end of the presentation, and I welcome any other question. This research work was done with Professor Elaine and also Rachel, and has been published by the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities. So, and it's open access, so you can have a read at the full paper if you want to do so. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yankee, for this really great presentation. I would encourage our attendees to come on camera if you'd like, and I'd love to open up the floor for questions for Dr. Yankee, for anyone who has something they'd like to ask or react to. I'm gonna open this up just so I can see our folks. I'll ask, you mentioned that there needs to be some further research perhaps in longitudinal, and I wonder what your own interests are in continuing this work, where you think the next most important analysis or study might be.
I think it would be nice to continue this research work, so I'm open to doing more research work within this space, to collaborate with the PRC towards looking at some of these longitudinal analysis of the NIP data sets. So if the PRC, there are folks who are interested in collaborating, I'm also willing to work more on that. Yeah. So yes, even though I'm doing more of demography stuff, I'm still opening to looking at food retail environment research work in Cleveland. Sure.
Well, I see a big smile on Elaine Bronowski's face.
We're ready for you, Ortis.
There's a great question in the chat from Laura that says, wondering if there are any cities that serve as a positive model around this topic. I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes where we know that there are disparities, it's easy to focus, it's easy to see that trend, but it's sometimes harder to find sort of those positive deviants or the cities who are doing it right. Have you come across any of those sorts of models in your work?
No, I think it's been a long time I looked at food environment literature. And so I can't say for sure whether there are there are cities where we have positive outcomes regarding this model, but I can't tell. I can't say I'm not confident in saying there are or there isn't, right? Because it's been a while since I looked at the literature on the food environment. Yeah.
I think your quote from your prior slide, though, would sort of indicate that this is a global phenomenon, right? That here we call it racial segregation, but just the colonialism across the country has really led to challenging challenges in food access. So, but Laura or others, if you know of positive models, please share them. I think this has been a long-standing challenge to figure out how to address some of the long-standing effects of segregation, right? And redlining, and bringing food to these spaces, and just right, the complexity as you shared of the market, right, the economy, the market, and those models that are not in step always with health. So yeah. Other questions? Elaine?
I have some comments. I think the one issue that we have longitudinally, though, Ortis, is that we know that segregation is so entrenched. It seems like it would take an awful long time to see changes. You'd have to have neighborhoods that were really changing on those variables for actually to see if the changes. But maybe we are experiencing that in Cleveland. I mean, that's a good question. Are there neighborhoods that are becoming less segregated, right, to be able to see change over time? So that's that would be one thing for us to chat about after. But I think the other thing is that, now with all this movement towards ultra processed foods, it's almost like flipping the model. This was predicting the healthy outlets, but it would be interesting to see. I mean, there's people that hypothesize the same of the other way, which is that underserved and minority communities are also the ones that have only ultra processed food available to them. So if you ended up flipping the count, and now it's the number of fast food and grocery stores and gas stations, and that, would you find, I think you actually did some of this in the process of whether it is actually the mirror of this, or is it different?
Yeah, I think, yes. One of the topic that I did was to look at the count of stores, whether some of these whether healthy and unhealthy co-cluster within a geographic space, right? Where we have healthy stores and also gas and corner stores all being located within a particular census tract. And I think for that particular research, we see that there is a co-clustering. So you find areas where healthy food co-cluster with corner stores, convenience stores within certain spaces in Cleveland. Yes, so it's true. We see a co-clustering of the stores here. But as to whether there is an association to be established with regard to this store, I have not looked at that. And so I think it will be important to then consider the count of these other stores, unhealthy stores, and look at whether there is a relationship with racial segregation as well as socioeconomic factors. The co-clustering only account for spatial effects. There is no other variable to explain why they are all co-clustered together within a particular geographic space. So I think it will be interesting to look at the flip side of the outcome of interest and see how things will shape out.
So you're talking about the co-clustering of the healthy and the unhealthy together, correct?
Yes.
And in that case, that almost seems like it would be population-based and economic-based, because that means these are geographic spaces that have a lot of food. They have both restaurants and grocery stores and everything. But what would be fascinating is that, are there clusters of only unhealthy food? Because I think we see it. I mean, when we draw these, some of these using this Fresh Finder map from the same data, we see large swaths of areas of Cleveland where there is not anything but a corner store and down, right, in that space. And the question would be, does segregation explain that? Because people would say that's an economic reason, but here they'd say that there's just not enough people, or there's reasons why there's not stores, but is the question, but if those are absent, but there's still all the unhealthy options, then it's even, it's almost inflating the impact of your own work. Yeah.
I think we have to test it to see.
I like that idea.
To see whether is it economic or is it socio-economic? Because without examining it, we cannot say for sure, why they are being clustered together within a particular space. Yeah. So it'll be interesting.
Well, the 2023 date is almost done, Ortis. So it's time to redo it on a new year.
Okay. Yeah.
This was awesome. Thank you. I got the chance to hear Ortis defend his dissertation, but this was, which was made to a lot of geographers. So thank you. You did a great job, I think, of really explaining this for our audience. Appreciate it.
There's another question in the chat. So I want to make sure to get to that from Richard Cole that says, did post-World War II suburban expansion have any impact? And then a second question, does planning in the UK, green belts, tend to keep central cities serviced by grocery stores?
This is a tough one. Okay, so, yeah.
I imagine the responses to those are dissertations in and of themselves, but.
Yeah, I think so. The first one asking about post-World War II are you talking about redlining of cities? And also, I recently migrated to the UK, so I don't know much when it comes to issues concerning food retail within the UK. And so I don't know if that answers the question.
Richard, I'd welcome you to come off of mute if you want to clarify your question, if you're able.
Hi, Otis. I'm from England. My background is in city planning. And sorry, my desktop doesn't have a camera, so I can't sort of wave hi to you. In terms of the post-World War II expansion, there's a lot of discussion on the depletion of grocery stores and food deserts. Is that because of redlining, or is that also as a result of the GI Bill and post-World War II suburban expansion and everybody leaving? Therefore, grocery stores went where the populations were moving. And secondly, I'm a great advocate of city planning and green belts, new town policy. Yes, it was a designed environment as opposed to a expansion and markets, grocery stores following demand. So I noticed that you worked at the University of Southampton, and I wondered whether, in terms of living in Southampton, you noticed a greater abundance of grocery stores in the city centre as opposed to Cleveland, just purely anecdotally, not a geographical spatial analysis.
Yep. Okay. I think with the first question regarding suburbanization happening after the Second World War, researchers like Dina, they trace the evolution of the supermarket landscape, and they've argued that when people began to move towards the suburban, then these supermarkets also, there was a flight of the supermarket towards the suburban. And someone like Thibodeau, which I cite here, even in one of his papers, argues that in the middle part of the 20th century, it was more common to find supermarket and grocery stores within inner cities, right? But as white, affluent people began to move towards the suburban, then this supermarket also shifted along with them. Living in Southampton, I don't, well, Southampton is a small city, so I haven't seen much of these corner stores. We always have these big stores around, which are positioned within central locations, so everybody can have access to some of these stores. But I'm sure when you take a city like London, which is quite big, we may see some of these, more of these corner stores in certain neighborhoods, probably ethnic minority neighborhood. I don't think Southampton doesn't have some of these issues because we have a large grocery stores which are centrally located, and so everybody can have access to them. And there are few corner stores when you walk around. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Do we have any last questions for Dr. Yankee? Well, hearing none, I want to thank everyone who stuck with us this afternoon for this fascinating and wonderful presentation. Dr. Yankee, thank you again. And it's wonderful to have you return. And I will say, well, it will be wonderful to continue to collaborate with you and see some ongoing work. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us next month for our presentation with Dr. Tan. Thank you so very much. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Ortis. Good to see you. Bye. I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Thanks again.
All right. Bye.